Oh, this is HDMI.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, so one of these, I think will work with hers.
All right, my friends. You people are still hopefully coming. Good to have you here. Thank you once again for coming. Think again, faith again. Thinking and faithing. Well, she does gracing, right? Hannah does gracing, I can do faithing. Anyway, we're excited to have Esther here. And her fine husband, Stephen came. Thank you. You're still kind of running the Mormon Transhumanist Association? Or?
Run it. I'm the chapter president of
Chapter
Utah
president.
Valley,
Okay, that's it.
but I am, as usual, trying to assert control of power.
Okay. Well, for anybody here or listening, you can go to the Mormon Transhumanist, right? Association. And that's kind of related to this whole AI thing.
Yeah, we have our next meetup a week from this Sunday, and Carl Youngblood is talking. He's the global president.
Yeah.
And his talk is on weathering the singularity. And the next upcoming year is all of this technology that's coming out of how to
Cool.
integrate that.
I like how Carl just keeps creating higher positions. So now he's global. That's
Oh,
cool.
he's been global for a while.
I know, that cracks me up.
I'm following in that footstep.
Good for you. You're the global chapter.
Yeah, my title needs to change to king or emperor.
I know Carl, he's good. He knows I'm teasing him, hopefully.
He does.
Thank you to Ed and Kristen Iverson for your lovely home. Appreciate that. And my wife, good wife Jane, managing the Zoom conversation. And let's see, who else was, oh, my neighbor Jim giving me his projector and screen to use. So grateful to them. Couldn't make it tonight. A number of people couldn't, unfortunately, but hopefully those that are here will gain a lot. I've asked Thane to offer opening prayer, if you would. Thank you. Okay. Why don't you come up here so we can see your face? I'm a little, since I have this oriented different, I'm a little afraid I'm going to knock everything off.
Dave, let's just check with the Zoom people to give a thumbs up if they can hear.
Okay, I did ask one earlier, but do that. Can you hear? Can you hear me?
Zoom people, can you hear?
Thumbs up?
Thumbs up? Okay,
Awesome. Thank you. All right, we'll make sure we can hear your prayer.
thank you.
Okay. Father in heaven, we're grateful for mountains, and the snow and the rain, and the beautiful spring that's rising up all around us. We thank thee for the gospel of Jesus Christ that teaches us to be kind and loving to all around us and to love our enemies. We pray that we may enjoy thy love and thy spirit and in all we do. We pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. And also thanks to Faith Matters for providing Zoom. Today, I loved how you noted specific natural things that are going on right now, which is a beautiful thing, you know, we're all in spring. So thank you for doing that. So on the way up here, Giles Florence. Giles, you're going to work your way up with your picture, right?
Okay.
Had a nice idea. So his son, Nate, is an artist. Nate is the one that did that really beautiful documentary called Bright Spark about, what is his name? Escape me. Trevor Salvi. If you haven't seen that, you can go online and see that. It's a gorgeous film.
Since you mentioned it,
Yeah.
PBS is showing it on the 15th.
Oh, excellent.
If you get the KUED 7
Yeah.
program.
Yeah.
It's featured in there as one of their programmer recommendations.
Cool.
Unfortunately, it's a shortened version. It
Really?
misses several of the really good jokes by Dennis Smith. But it does also say at the end, if you want to see the full version, which is I think 15 or 20 minutes more or something. See that.
Excellent.
I had this thought tonight as I read ahead what we were supposed to check in about
Come over here a
Esther,
little more.
about Esther and her work. I supposed to look into that light?
No, you can, if you're just off the side, you
Yeah.
might be okay.
We can. check
Terribly
that.
bright.
No, it's fine. I'll just
No,
look at it.
no, just-
I've admired Esther's work and I know of her concern for gender and race in the depiction of Christ and divine things, divine beings. And my son Nathan did a painting of what, I'll pass this around because it's just a little one. The big one is pretty good size. And it's a painting of a woman walking with Christ and she's doing the talking, which is sort of the reversal of the roles that we traditionally see. Most women, as Nathan describes in the artist statement on the back, most things he saw of women in Jesus' paintings as he grew up were passive women, unless they were married. And so this lady, this disciple, is walking beside him and she's the one talking or raising the questions or making the points, whatever. The two of them, if you look closely, will see that they're just slightly elevated off the ground. And he did this for a stake center that was burned by arson. So as he describes in his work here, it's a work of art that came from a crime. So, but it's the beauty of it, in my mind, is that it is that reversal of roles. And I won't say more, but I thought it was appropriate because this is such a personal group that we often share, personal things here. And because this is a proud father, not only moved by, but impressed by this work. He doesn't make prints of his art typically, but he's made some of these just because of so many people have asked him for copies, but it is on the church website. So that's as much as I can say without taking any time more from Esther, from whom we are eager to hear. And I'll just pass these around or you can look at them later so as not to distract, but okay.
Thanks, Giles.
Yeah. thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, Esther. So hopefully you have looked on the website and saw her bio. Which is impressive. Anyway, I'm gonna turn it over to you now. Take it away.
You, glad to be here. We've got such a small group. Who do names really quickly? I know a few of you already, but. I'm Pam. And Pam, Alan,
Martina,
Martina,
my daughter asked me.
Aspen.
This is Stephen.
I think I know him.
Giles.
Yeah.
Taylor.
Thane. Kristen.
Our
Lovely,
host.
thank you.
You two can come on the couch if you want. Come on, it's
He only bites
comfy.
sometimes.
We don't have enough people for a back row, it seems like, tonight, for some reason, so. Come on over.
Yeah, so a little context here. I'm recycling a little bit of presentation I did for Southern Virginia University a few years ago for an honors colloquium that they held, but I thought it was a great starting point to talk a little bit about how we ended up with the colloquial image of Christ that we have in the American church and some of the influences that went into that. And I think the reason it's important to start by framing it that way is because that's the data that AI is then creating images off of. And so understanding the data set before we understand what's been created with the data set is important context. Okay, so one of the challenges with depicting Christ is that the source text is very limited. There are little to no descriptions of Christ in the Bible or in any sort of extant text we have from the time period. And as we'll go through, oops, I switched on the wrong one. There we go. As we'll go through, there are things that people have thought were legitimate text and that have consistently been proven to have been fabricated throughout history. And I think as an artist, this is actually kind of a beautiful thing because it gives a lot of room for interpretation, but it does create an emptiness, which creates a point of tension within the history of Christianity and a point where other ideologies and politics can be inserted for better or worse. So the earliest image that we currently have of Christ is a piece of graffiti called the Alexamenos Graffitio from Rome in about 200 AD. And it's actually a little bit of anti-Semitic scribbling that they found. And it syncretizes some of the imagery of the time which used donkeys to represent Jews, and the donkey is being crucified. It's half man, half donkey, representing this idea that Christ was a demigod. And the text roughly reads, Alexamenos worships his God. So mocking a Christian at that time of like, look at this stupid God that the Christians are worshiping. But I just think it's so fascinating. This is the earliest image that we have, because first 100 to 200 years, Christians really weren't making images of Christ. And so it was people outside trying to describe or make fun of, in this case, what they were seeing within the religion. Going forward, you start to see a little bit more 200 to 300 AD. And at this point, you start to see specific trends of syncretization, where they're taking the framework of either the religion of the prevailing region or the religion they might have converted from, and trying to marry that with the new theology of Christianity. And there's 4 basic trends that arise during the first couple hundred years of Christianity. First off, you have Christ as a young boy, which parallels him to Apollo or Dionysus, a symbol of new life, renewal, abundance, and light. This is an example here. Not something I think contemporary Christians would recognize as a Christ symbol. If you look a little closely, though, you've got the lambs. He's carrying one. He's carrying a bucket of water. So there are some symbols that have carried through. But as far as his physical manifestation, nothing like we ever see in the Common Era. But this would have been very understandable to a Roman or Greek convert to Christianity. Next, we get Christ as a powerful ruling God, paralleling him to Zeus or Jupiter. So kind of the opposites, humble shepherd versus powerful God, then marrying that with the imagery they had of the ruling gods of their pantheon at the time. A bearded man, flowing locks. Christ is the creator and ruler of the world. This is where we get the Pantocrator symbolism we see, where he's sitting with like a halo around him, ruler of the world. And this is where we start to get this curly-haired, long-bearded image that has carried through today.
Esther, 2 mind questions as they come along from the chat.
Sure, yeah.
Dan Eastman asks, could it be that early images were not made of Christ because Jews/Christians adhered to the commandment not to make graven images?
I'm sure that was an element of it. I'm not a historian by trade, so I don't feel qualified to say that, but it seems like a logical conclusion. Yeah. Okay, and then next we get Christ as a philosopher, aged, disheveled, humble in appearance. You get a lot of Roman ideas of physiognomy coming into this idea that the way you present yourself is parallel to what you have to offer to your community. And then last of all, we get a little bit more of a Jewish syncretization, which is Christ as a worker of miracles. The really fun thing with this is you also get a little bit of syncretization of early like mystical societies and things like what's it called? A lot of these,
Gnostics?
not Gnostics, but some of the ones where they had secret rites and things that often had parallels, as we know, to
Mormons.
symbolism. Yeah, the Mormons. I don't think we were around at this period. What? Yeah, like those types of things. But here we have Christ with a wand. That is a magic wand that he's holding. This idea that he is wielding mystical power to create miracles, a la the prophets of the Old Testament.
That's really a cool painting. It
Right.
reminds me a little, or she's just a little bit.
I'll tell Brian that. I've been hanging out with him this month. Been working on a painting at the gallery.
Oh, nice.
Another really interesting thing, it's not quite as common as those other 4 things, but we see a little bit of this pop up during about 300 to 500 AD. And this is probably influenced a lot by Gnosticism, is this idea of an androgynous or hermaphroditic Christ, because God transcends gender. And so this idea of we can't put him in a box, and so we're not going to depict him as a specific gender.
Kind of got away from that.
Yeah, it was kind of a little bit of a blip in history, but I think it's a fun sidetrack to
Yeah,
go down, because I think,
fascinating.
yeah, I think we often have this idea that like Christ has been depicted this way, and we don't realize the breadth that has
Yeah.
become narrowed really only in the last 200-ish years.
Yeah.
During 800 to 1500, you get Christian missionaries going through to the east. There's not a lot of surviving images, but you'll get usually Jesuit influenced images coming out of monasteries or occasionally converted Chinese or Indian individuals creating images, and there's some of my favorite, and I wish more of them had survived because the little bits and pieces we have are so fascinating. At this point, you're getting syncretism of Buddhism,
Yeah,
other types of Eastern sects as well.
Thomas McConkie would love
Okay, who would
that.
find him one. And then obviously the oldest continuing sect of Christianity, which is Ethiopian Christianity, the Coptic Church. You get images starting. There's a few that are before 800, depending on what medium you're looking at, but tons and tons of images from Ethiopia.
So I've heard of the Armenians were one of the earliest. too,
Yes, yeah, and unfortunately, I think part of the reason we don't have a lot of work from them is just
right?
the course of modern history destroying all
Yeah, I
of
was
said
gonna say, they
artwork.
got massacred, yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, what we have is not an indication of what was created, it's an indication of what survived and what we have access to. Because I think there's plenty of things that, for whatever reasons, we just don't have access to within Western education circles, and things like that. Moving into the medieval period, we see a shift towards focusing less on what Christ actually looked like versus manifestations of his blood and wounds, and this obsession with artifacts related to the crucifixion of Christ. So this is where we get things like the Shroud of Turin, which is supposedly the cloth that was draped over Christ's face and left with an impression of his face.
So that word about blood and wounds, how do you
Uh-huh.
pronounce that?
Archupite, I think.
And does it mean blood and wounds, or is it just the style of?
It's
Is it
artifacts.
artifacts?
Yeah, so these
Okay.
objects versus a depiction of. You know, this is something that pops up nowadays all the time, and kind of the mythos surrounding how do we depict Christ, because people see it as a primary source of Christ features, which that is a whole different rabbit hole we could go down.
Yeah,
but-
I say. Not really
There's been a lot of interesting back and forth on the veracity of that as an object. This is one that has been proven to be absolutely fabricated, but still is deeply influential, specifically on the American perception of Christ. We'll look at that a little bit in the Reconstructionist era of America. So the letter of Lentulus was supposedly a description of Christ by, I think it was a Roman soldier, but it was fabricated during the 1400s. Who knows, you know, what the intent of the fabrication was, but it went viral in a sense during that time, and then has resurfaced during different periods of history when it was convenient as a supposed primary source text for a description of Christ. One of the indicators that it's forgery is it uses descriptors such as a ruddy hue and light brown hair, and these terms align with medieval theories of bodily humors rather than the Greco-Roman physiognomy. So earlier it talked about Christ either as like a god who's majestic or a philosopher who's disheveled. Those are the type of words that would have been used if it really was a Roman of the 1st century AD describing Christ, versus this idea of what do your humors create in your physical appearance that was prevalent during medieval times.
Esther, another question
Yeah.
from a Zoom participant. Mike Maxwell asks, have you seen any early depictions of Christ as a healer? I was reading recently that Christians ministering to citizens of Rome during the many Roman pandemics of the first 3 centuries AD significantly raised Christians' credibility across the empire.
Not that I'm thinking of off the top of my head, but again, that would be an interesting thing to look into. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some, even maybe like graffiti down in the catacombs. That was a prevailing narrative during the time. Things I have to look into. Okay, so moving on into early America. So pre-revolution America, some of the earliest groups that came, one of them was the Moravians, which I was actually not super familiar with this group until I started researching for this original presentation. But they are a somewhat small sect, but very influential within early America because they were largely responsible for some of the earliest proselytizing to Native American populations. And so they vastly influenced early Native American conceptions of Christianity and Christian art. And kind of like you see with the medieval archetype, there was this obsession with the wounds of Christ, that it was Christ as a bloodied body without recognizable form, because that represents his sacrifice. And so a lot of the depictions coming from the Moravian movement don't even actually show a human body or a external figure. It's focusing on the wound as the sacrifice. And we also see this marrying then with some Native American ideologies surrounding blood and blood sacrifice as well. Okay, one of the things I think we see a lot of misconception around in the current narrative is this idea that we are a Christian nation and have been a Christian nation from the inception. We were a nation of freedom of religion. We were by no means a Christian nation in the inception any more or less than, you know, the rest of the world was at that time period. And we also weren't culturally an extremely religious nation during the revolution. And so people also didn't have access to art and things like that. So this idea of having Christ in your home was a completely foreign concept for the first about 100 or so years of the country. But it was very common to have pictures of George Washington because he was viewed as the savior, the builder of the nation at the time. And there's some interesting first-person accounts of Europeans coming to America during this time period and seeing how many people had pictures of George Washington in their home, being like, this is kind of like faulty a little bit. I'd never slowed down and thought about that. Like, what were people hanging in their homes in, 1780? It wasn't Jesus, it was George Washington. The first time Christianity was clearly invoked in a State of the Union address was by Andrew Jackson to justify and sacralize the removal of the heathen Cherokee from their lands. And you'll see some trends here where like it's actually the South using Christianity as justification that really starts to bring it into the forefront of the political narrative of the US. And it wasn't the North, it was consistently the South.
Justify slavery.
Yeah, among other things. One of the fascinating parallels is this point where you see the rise of the Restoration movement. Prevailing narratives describing the divine during the 16th and 17th century. You're looking at a lot of, scientific discoveries that are happening, the Enlightenment, trying to bring those ideas and syncretize them with religion. And so there's a lot of conversation surrounding light as a purest form of essence or matter. And then that continues to evolve in different political directions over the next 100 years. And so if you track the different recorded versions of the first vision, it actually evolves in parallel with these narratives, where the earliest descriptions of the first vision talk about light. And there's very little description of the heavenly body, like it was, personages, but it's very, very little specific description. All the way to the final one in 1845, which gives the only clearly racialized description of a divine being that we have in the Restoration canon. This racialized description is even more clearly white by racial standard than the standard conceptualizations of Christ at the time, because again, at this point, there wasn't a commonly accepted image of Christ. This is before we get a lot of the commercialized images that we get in the 19th and late 18th centuries.
Are you speaking specifically Christian or faith?
Well, we didn't have any canon of art at that point because we were, 200 people.
Yeah. Okay.
But no, it's just fascinating seeing how Joseph Smith's language was evolving in parallel with the common narratives in Christian spaces. And I think that's something that we as Latter-day Saints often forget, is that the Restoration didn't happen in a bubble. And that our thinking and our culture, even though it was radical for the time, was still heavily influenced by the other things that were evolving at the time and has continued to be influenced. And that's why the Restoration is ongoing, because there's always room to continue to clarify and purify and rethink and reinvent the way that we're discussing and depicting
It's interesting.
our theology.
From a science perspective, white light, being a beam of light that looks white, contains every color in the rainbow.
Yeah.
It's not the absence of color. It's the combination of all colors.
Yeah, and that was part of the idea, is like everything coming together is a unified field theory in a sense. Before unified field theory was a thing, you see a little of that happening in the theology of the 1800s. Moving into the Industrial Revolution, we see a fascinating ideological shift around just the idea of creating images for sacred spaces within the American consciousness, because American communities were heavily influenced by Puritan ideology in the beginning. Puritan ideology was iconoclastic, this idea that we're rejecting the opulence and the visual culture of Catholicism for an austerity that focuses on the Word of God. And so we see an almost overnight flip-flop to seeing aesthetics and beauty as a manifestation of God within Presbyterian communities in America, which is in contrast to what they've been thinking and talking and doing for the last 200 years.
You're speaking just primarily of America.
Yes, so at this point we
Because in
transition to
Europe, I
America.
mean,
Oh yeah,
art and all that, of course. Okay.
yeah. Europe is a lot harder to distill as an identity, and I'm focusing on America too, because America is what's influenced the Latter-day Saint tradition. Like, we are not influenced by the European tradition beyond the things that have come over from Europe and created the American consciousness. And I would also argue that as Europe has moved away from Christianity, the base of Christian culture is America in many ways at this point in history, and so that is what's more largely informing global consciousness, at least within the aesthetic culture of Christianity. It is American ideas and ideals. So yeah, also we see a lot of visual content being used to draw lines and refine what it means to be American and what American ideals are. And things like tracts and pamphlets and newspapers were very influential in forming public identity and opinion on things, and oftentimes were not so subtly tinged with the politics of the time as well. Alternately, it's fascinating looking at enslaved individuals' experiences and narratives during this time period as well, because I think it's often easy from a retrospective, maybe white-centric liberal perspective to be like, well, they must have hated the white Jesus. And that was not the narrative during the time. To them, it was a contrast of what a good white man could be versus what the lived experience of the white man was. And so it's this idea of he was a white savior in a sense, but not a white oppressor. And they saw in him a fellow suffering servant, a source of solace, and a man who stood in stark contrast to those that they knew. So this idea of like an ideal that, their enslavers could theoretically live up to, but were not living up to.
Never thought about that link of he was whipped and hung on a tree.
Yep. And we'll see that in
that's
the
very
Harlem
interesting.
Renaissance. Yeah, that resurfaces again.
Foreshadowing.
A lot of varied responses from the Native American population as well. Some natives saw the preaching of a white crucified Christ as a signifier of white spiritual and intellectual inferiority. One of my favorite quotes that I found while I was researching for this was a conversation Tecumseh had with William Henry Harrison, and he asked him, how can we have confidence in the white people when Jesus came upon the earth and you killed him and nailed him on a cross?
Yeah.
Valid point,
Valid
Tecumseh.
point.
It's just, kind of said, and like, there's so many layers to the burn here. Because at the time, white Americans did not view Jews as white. But to Tecumseh, Christ was presented to him as white, therefore the Jews are white, therefore the white people crucified the white Christ. And so it's fascinating seeing the logical gymnastics that are happening between the two cultures and the politics and the Christianity that gets caught in the middle of it. Okay, moving into Civil War era, Christ becomes a rallying point for the South. This idea of justifying our cause under the banner of God. And a lot of their PR materials, a lot of their propaganda were very explicitly Christian, especially in comparison to the Union's materials. So a lot of that type of imagery. Also, this is the first time where we see a shift towards a militarized Christ, which is fascinating because Europe had gone through the cycle of like a peaceful versus a militarized Christ, maybe a couple times already. One of my favorite papers I wrote in grad school was about the way that they redid some of the imagery within the Notre Dame Cathedral pre versus post Crusades, and how they wrote back into the stories of certain saints to make them militarized when they were not originally militarized as a way of justifying the militarization of the Crusades. And we see the same thing with the Confederate South, this idea of focusing on the militaristic aspect of Christ as a way of justifying the ideal Southern man and the cause of the South. And then post-Civil War, he became a symbol of the lost cause ideology. Jefferson Davis was frequently typified as Christ, including hymns being written about him as a form of Christ, as a symbol of Christ. This is one of those. Jefferson Davis, still we honor thee, our Lamb victorious, who for us endured a cross of martyrdom, a crown of thorns, a soul's Gethsemane, a nation's hate, a dungeon's gloom, another God in chains.
Hmm.
Does that feel eerily familiar, just in current political rhetoric? It's funny studying this period in the way that like Christian imagery is used to promote ideas and to create a sense of unification within the South in the Reconstruction era, and then paralleling that to things we're seeing, especially in like white evangelical movements at the moment. Latter-day Saint communities are fascinating because we're a little bit fractionated on that, where we, there's parts of the community that really bought into the white evangelical approach that mirrors this, and there's other parts that have very vocally rejected it. And we don't necessarily have, I would say, a unified identity in the same way that I think mainstream white evangelicalism does in parallel with white nationalism and things at the moment.
It's interesting that they focus on the Jews' role
Mm-hmm.
when, I mean, they clearly had a role.
Yeah.
But they couldn't do a crucifixion.
Mm-hmm.
And so I find that interesting that it's the murdering Jews,
Mm-hmm.
forgetting that Romans were also present.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely informed by the Roman culture as well. So one of the
Oh, no.
yeah, so
Oh.
as you all know, the KKK is heavily influenced by Christianity and heavily uses it within their symbolism. And they very actively and very conscientiously used this as part of their propaganda. And you can find a lot of primary sources talking about how they are trying to justify white supremacist ideologies by reinterpreting the Bible, by resurrecting things like the Lentilist letter to justify their positioning in the racial landscape of the early 20th century. So trying to legitimize historical proof, other cooked up archaeological theories to prove Christ is right. And then we also, it's fascinating because they basically like dig up everything from the last like 1,000 years of Christianity, because they got all the way back to these Greek and Roman ideas of physiognomy, and they tried to reverse engineer Christ's race based on those ideas. That if white is goodness, if white is justice, if white is the most evolved version of humanity, therefore then Christ is white. And so it's all these little bits and pieces from the different ways Christ has been envisioned being drug up and reframed in a way to support the cause of white supremacy and white nationalism.
Those first bunch of ifs are very
Yeah, right. Fascinating enough, this backfired on them a couple times in some of the early race tensions on citizenship in the United States. So there was a Syrian immigrant named George Dow, and he faced a challenge to his eligibility for American citizenship in the 1910s. And so the Syrian American Association made the argument that he was descended from the same group of people that Christ was descended from. And if you're going to argue that Christ was white, therefore he, who clearly visually was not white, was white as well. And based on that, because they based it on the Bible, they were able to pass his citizenship request. Meanwhile, Bhagat Singh, who was scientifically classified as a Caucasian because he was from the Caucasus Mountains from the same time period, was denied because he looked very similar to George, but also had outward religious markers of not being Christian.
Oh.
And so it's just, how are we dividing those lines? What is the higher priority in our social hierarchy of truth? And in this case, they're leaning into the Bible, bit them in a butt a little bit, thankfully, for George and his family at least. Okay, and then going into the period of the World Wars, obviously this piece is not from the World Wars, this is a contemporary piece by John McNaughton, but it definitely feeds on some of this sentiment we've seen since, the 1920s onward. We see, again, a leaning into this militarized Christ, that we are a militarized nation, that we have to be strong in the face of world conflict. And if we are a Christian nation, then our God must also be violent. Our God must also be this virile man. This quote here by Robert Warren Conant is from a book I'll show you in a second. It says, the men of a strenuous age demand a strenuous Christ. If we want to win modern men to the church, we must quit preaching the meek and lowly Jesus and substitute the fighting Christ. I think it's funny. If we want to win modern men, it's this idea of like, if we're going to convert, we need to reframe our image of God. It's not about going back to the source text. It's not about going back to, trying to discover truth. It's about, okay, what version of our God best appeals to the outcome that we want.
It's marketing.
And absolutely, that's what religion is. It's marketing. Yeah.
But it is. Did Arnold Freiberg ever do a Jesus Christ? Because they would have been
Yes.
very buff.
It would have been very buff. We'll actually get to that in a couple
Okay.
slides. So it's really funny. When I was going back and reviewing this, I went to check something on Robert Warren, and there's a republished version of his book, The Virility of Christ. And this cover is AI. And I just thought it was hilarious how this has come full circle, because this book was originally published, I think, in like the 1940s. And so somebody's republished it and slapped a beautiful white AI Jesus on the cover. Just like, coming back around. Okay, but at the same period, we also have the Harlem Renaissance happening. And this is where we see, like you're saying, this idea of we understand Christ because he was lynched by a mob. And so we see a lot of lynching imagery in the Harlem Renaissance imaginations of Christ, because they could see themselves in, a racial minority, persecuted by the government, facing mob violence. That was a very familiar narrative to them and something that they could find hope in through depicting that. From that point on, we start to see, much like the church in America fractionated, you have the Black church and the white church, and you get immigrant communities bringing in their versions of Christianity. You also see art that starts to reflect that. And especially through, the 1960s, 70s, there's a lot of very fascinating imagery of Christ that was produced. So a little bit of it like building it with like mysticism and like syncretization with Eastern belief and things like that. And some of these are contemporary images. A lot of these are from Latter-day Saint artists, but just kind of examples of that type of syncretization of culture and the different culturally informed sects of Christianity. But at the same time, we also have technology evolving to the point where we can mass produce full color images in a way that we've never been able to throughout history. And this image specifically is the most sold image of Christ ever produced. And it was really just a marketing scheme. The artist was lucky enough to have some friends that were good marketers and found a way to, this is the image that got shipped out with all soldiers during, I think, World War II. Somehow they got the military to buy little prints and put them in with the soldier packets and things like that. It's just wildly popular, not necessarily because it's a particularly good painting, but just because it was able to be marketed and had the right funding behind the marketing to become so widely accessible. And it's a great example of how it doesn't matter, how many of the images were being produced in the Harlem Renaissance. It doesn't matter how many of, the Christian Chinese immigrants are making their own images. Because this was marketed, this is what the American consciousness recognizes and accepts.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
The painter, the artist.
Oh, I should put it in here. I'm forgetting off the top of my. The funny thing is, Johnson, he really didn't do a lot of other art. It's kind of a one-hit wonder.
He retired
sort of
after
situation.
that.
Honestly, he should have. I would, if that was me. Okay, so looking at Latter-day Saint culture that's evolving during the same time period as well. Latter-day Saint depictions of Christ, there really weren't a lot pre-manifesto for a variety of reasons. One, we were still very influenced by Puritan iconoclastic ideologies. This idea, we don't make pictures of God, we don't make things that are luxurious. And also lots of limitations socioeconomically. We were wandering across the desert and living in the middle of nowhere.
Being chased around.
And even though there are some really amazing oil paintings from that early time period, it just was not a highly accessible or high priority thing for the Latter-day Saint community. Post-manifesto, there was a big push to integrate with the broader American Christian community. And you also see at this point trying to introduce aesthetic elements of that culture as well, to be like, hey, we're a little bit more mainstream. We've stopped doing the whole polygamy thing. And part of that was starting to produce images of Christ. Now, a lot of the interesting push and pull that happened during that time is that the leadership of the church, depending on which leader, had very strong opinions of what that should and shouldn't look like. David O. McKay was probably one of the most influential leaders at that time period, and he was very much of the, we should not depict deity, because how could we even do justice to deity? And so the reason that Arnold Friedberg does not have any depictions of Christ in his paintings is because that was an instruction from David O. McKay. So this is the one image, it's behind the words here, but the one image of Christ in the Friedberg painting is him descending, and it's a little tiny glowy figure that like you just barely
Can't
feel
see
like,
the muscles.
no, there's just like a very, very big outline of a glowy figure.
Just like get up close, you can see the muscle.
I'm sure you can, get out a microscope. It's okay, we got plenty of muscles here.
Yeah.
My favorite thing to do with Freiberg's is to look at the muscles and then figure out how many of them are made up. Because some of his muscles don't even
That makes
follow
sense.
the laws of anatomy. Like, it's not just like steroid muscles, it's like straight up imagined muscles. Okay, so jumping up to the current time period, it was funny because I originally did this presentation about 2 years ago before AI became really mainstream. And at that point, I was really excited and hopeful for where the images, where the visual culture of the Latter-day Saint community was at, because I felt like it had become very democratized and very diverse. There's a lot of rising artists making new images. There was movement, grassroots level and also institutionally, to diversify the way that we're depicting divinity. At the grassroots level, that also includes Heavenly Mother and Heavenly Parents in our images, including Christ. And then coming back to this now 2 years later, there's been a little bit of a pendulum swing as far as what's broadly accessible because of the advent of AI. And so whereas these voices had a lot more bandwidth on, social media channels and things like that 3 years ago, they're being crowded out a little bit because AI is producing images at a rate that no human artist can ever keep up with. And because it's drawing from, the 2,000 years previous to this rush of diverse images that really only started happening in the last, 100 years, and for the Latter-day Saint community, really only the last 5 years, those images are very, very homogeneous.
Can you share the message at the bottom right?
Oh, yes, this was me.
No, the bottom right image.
Oh, this one. So this is a Heavenly Mother painting by Kiwani Winder.
Yeah.
It's this idea of Heavenly Mother holding a soul.
Yeah, okay.
This is from her tribe in her Santa Clara Puebla, I think is her tribe. So that's like the symbol kind of for like a baby or a soul right
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
What's the name? Kiwani Winder, Kiwani Puebla Winder.
Esther, to confirm what you said about the AI, I used AI to make that image.
Mhm.
And it hardly makes any difference when it's
Mhm.
Chinese, Native American,
Yeah.
Black, and it's very specific in what I'm asking, and they're very similar.
Oh yeah, it's just like different skin tone.
Yeah, very slight
Yeah.
difference
Yeah.
between them, and I tried several different,
No,
programs, and
it
was
clearly has.
it was frustrating.
Yeah, it clearly has biases because of the data set. It was fair.
Yeah,
So this is what we are getting so much of at the moment. Like you get on Instagram, you get on Facebook. These are coming from accounts with literally hundreds of thousands of followers that are producing dozens of new images every day. And, my feelings as like an artist aside, what's frustrating just as like someone who tries to keep her finger on the pulse of culture is how quickly things have homogenized. That like, you look at any of these accounts and they're interchangeable with each other. Like there's no distinct artistic voice. There's sort of like an AI aesthetic. And it's this common denominator of like, we want Jesus that's pretty. We don't want Jesus that like says anything specific. We want Jesus that blends in with our tan and gray house decorations.
and big furniture.
Furniture, yeah. Like, this is Daybreak. If Daybreak was Jesus painting. Definitely gonna be limiting. And I just think it's really fascinating to see like how it like widened and then narrowed like very, very quickly. Aesthetically. So this last section here, I don't feel like I am qualified to give answers to questions, but I wanted to pose you guys with some questions now that we've got kind of the framework of how we get to where we are. that we can discuss, and I can give you my thoughts on it. My thoughts on that will probably change in 6 months, in a year, I don't know. I don't want to commit to an opinion on some of these things, just because I think the environment is so volatile, and the cultural and theological questions surrounding this are very much being asked presently, but I think it's very important that we ask them presently. So some of the questions I've been wrestling with is how, first, these are some thoughts. So how deity is depicted is a litmus test for the biases and tensions at any point in history. I think within the Latter-day Saints tradition specifically, we're so used to treating all of our materials as didactic, as like a primary source of truth, that we have a hard time sometimes stepping back and recognizing that they're more so a reflection of the moment they were created in. And that, you know, while they might have truth in them, how that truth is filtered, how that truth is presented is very much informed by the environment of its creation. And I think images of God are kind of, in many ways, the prime example of that, whether that's Christian images or from other religions. It's like, what is that culture prioritizing? What powers are they trying to emphasize? Who are they trying to put down? Who are they trying to raise up? If you look at how they depict God, it should answer all of those questions. And the profuse use of AI, it's an iteration of this, pun somewhat intended. We worship ease, we worship consumerism, we worship conformity. We haven't stopped to question the data sets that we're basing the production of our new images on. In many ways, parallel to the ways we haven't stopped to question what produced these systems and the institutions that we currently are wrestling with in our community. So in this case, the message is the medium as much as anything. So the way the images are being delivered to us is the message as much as the images are themselves. So a little example of this, I plugged a couple prompts into Midjourney as a way of exemplifying exactly what you're saying, where it's got this idea of what Jesus should look like, and it consistently pumps out that idea. And so I told it, just make me a painting of Jesus. This is what a painting of Jesus is from Midjourney. Then I asked it, make me a Latter-day Saint painting of Jesus.
That's about
Wait,
right.
Rocky Mountains.
That's about right.
Are those eyes blue?
No, surprisingly, all the eyes were brown. So I was like,
Oh,
okay,
okay.
could be more Nordic. Then I said, you know, for good measure, make me a Mormon painting, just because Latter-day Saint is a little bit of a newer term.
Jocelyn.
One of my employees, who knows I'm giving a lecture. I thought that funny that the Mormon Jesus was happier and less austere, and I'd love to
I
know
like
why
that.
that is.
Yeah.
I don't know that, you know, it's almost impossible to know how it percolated that out, but I just thought it was a funny little tidbit, yeah.
You know, that raises for me a very interesting cultural distinction between traditionally the Eastern Orthodox
Uh-huh.
paintings of Christ, which are nearly all agony
Mm-hmm.
paintings.
Yeah.
They show him in just the most in extremity,
Mhm.
always the sorrow. It's sort of like Eastern literature, like
Yeah.
the Russian literature. If you read it, it's just full of pathos and tragedy and whatever. The Western picture, and Mormons, we've got to be the most idealistic of any,
Mm-hmm.
want to see this happy
Yeah.
Jesus because we want him to make us happy. And
Yeah.
there's this
A
image
little bit of a
of
prosperity
it's
gospel.
all
Yeah.
good, you know, it's all gonna work out. And somehow that dark, tragic image of the Eastern is just so loaded with
Mhm.
pathos, with emotion and
Yeah, and one of my personal theories
suffering.
with Latter-day Saint art's obsession with like a happy, clean Jesus is it's also vestiges of our anti-Catholic roots. The church has been very anti-Catholic for much of its history, and you know, largely because of its Puritan roots. You know, might be a little bit hard to prove. That's somewhat of, you know, Esther's take on LDS art history, but
Makes
it's
sense.
something that we see very much on institutional level. It's something I've experienced as an artist working in institutional spaces, that if there's any amount of blood, like, and I mean like literally any amount of blood, if there's like significant sadness, like there is often like institutional hesitance and pushback because Christ is happiness, Christ is joy, why would we depict something else?
Well, it's like the cross, right? We're not
Mhm.
supposed to wear the cross or have it hanging up on the walls
Right.
because that focuses on the death
Yeah.
versus like joyful, happy things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm really pleasantly surprised to see shifts away from that just in the last couple of years. And that's something we've been trying to really actively do at my gallery. We've been running a show for the last 3 Easters that tries to focus on Easter pre the resurrection, because there's so little Latter-day Saint art for that time period of the Holy Week, that it's all about Easter morning. Or, maybe something like Palms, it's like, we go Palm Sunday, Easter morning, in
That's right.
the Latter-day Saint canon, and ignore the other,
And miserable.
yeah, the other 6 days in the middle.
So when you're talking institution, you're talking particularly about our church.
Mhm. Yeah. So one of the things we wrestle with within the Latter-day Saint community is we don't have a canonized theology of images. Like, you look at the Catholic Church and they have a specific way that you're supposed to think about, talk about, interact with art in their liturgical practice. We don't, even though we very robustly use, create, commission, patronize art within our community. And I think a lot of the tensions we're currently seeing is because we culturally, institutionally haven't prioritized supporting language and conversations and healthy criticism surrounding the visual aspects of our theological expression. We do slightly better, I think, with written works. That's, basis of any Latter-day Saint meeting these days, supposedly, is supposed to be, let's sit down, let's, discuss, maybe not debate, but critically consider our canonized materials. But we don't ever do that with art. We accept it at face value and don't engage with it and don't know how to engage with it. And that creates tensions and gaps, and oftentimes supports untheologically founded beliefs in other areas of our religious practice, because it's consciously or subconsciously informed by our visual culture.
Esther, would you mind giving some examples of the gaps and the tensions, like specifically?
Let's go for it. So this lovely little gem, oh yeah,
Oh, I would just say we do have a canonized depiction of Christ.
oh, we absolutely do.
I went to
Yeah,
Deseret's book because I wanted to take a picture of Jesus to one of my patients.
Yeah.
And I looked and I looked and they were all the same.
Mhm.
They were all boring. They were all dressed in white.
Come down to the
and-
compass. We got you.
Yeah, so, they're the gaps.
And
of
non-Semitic.
Anything else.
Yeah.
And they're
Well,
not
and so
Semitic.
we
Oh, no.
absolutely have a
Yeah.
canonized
Jewish.
image of Christ. What we don't have is a canonized art philosophy. Like, we don't have an idea of like, because like within Catholicism, you have this idea that like art can be a religious object that you have a religious experience with. This idea of an icon, that's a very
Like a rosary
simplified.
beads? or something
Yeah. And
like
there's specific ways that theological writing and talking around art in Catholicism functions and happens and has the historical precedent for it. Whereas in Latter-day Saint culture, we just kind of accept that it's here. We don't really talk about or wrestle with or have a definition for what it's doing in our communities and in our learning spaces. So to give you an example, the church just updated their like gospel questions and topics section on their website last week, and they added this. And I was really excited to see it added, but I also had to laugh a little bit at how much weight the word some is carrying in this sentence.
Instead of
Including
most?
All.
All the films the church makes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I think this is a great example of like, we haven't really wrestled with what is the role of art and artists in our community, and what does it mean for something to be canonized or not canonized? And how do we draw boundaries?
And they also put that a level deeper than everything else in that question. So
yeah.
it took me 30 minutes to find it. I
Yeah.
finally had to go back to the newspaper article and use the link because they put it 2 levels
They do,
down.
they dash them in a corner or something.
Yeah. They also don't have a subtitle like link to it
No.
in the top of the
don't,
article.
right.
It's like they just skip over it. There's subtitle links for all the other headers, but not for that one.
So it's a little odd. It's like, I'm glad they did it and it's actually well done, but they hit it.
No, and I think that was probably, somewhat intentional, because there's a lot of strong feelings around that. Like, one of the few times I've gotten an angry call at the gallery was when we did our first Mosaic of Christ show, which is all diverse depictions of Christ, and we did a lot of marketing for it. We had a couple great newspaper articles that came out about it leading up to it. And we got some random dude called the gallery one day and chewed us out because how dare we depict Christ as anything other than white? And we've done all sorts of random things at the gallery over the years, but that was like the one thing that we got angry calls.
Were you able to guess his particular skin color?
I'm not gonna make judgments, it was a wrong call, but it was like, okay, you were entitled to that opinion, it's a free country. So just some ideas that I've noticed inform the way we think about and talk about our art within our community. We have a strong history of isolationism as Latter-day Saints, perceptions of superiority in our religious practice, religious xenophobia, and they've encouraged this idea that that we have a liturgical canon. And what I mean by that is that there are specific images that are supposed to inform your religious practice and learning. And that this is institutionally enforced on members, which is not true. Like, it's a little more complicated, but broadly that is not true. And so this results in a sentiment that I see all the time where people will say things to me like, oh, I like that image, but Deseret Book doesn't sell it, therefore I can't use it in Sunday school. Therefore I can't use it in my seminary class. And I'm like, show me the handbook. Where does the handbook tell you that? But because we have these ideas and sort of emotions within our community, we apply that to the way we think and talk about art without ever pausing to question why that is. And thankfully, I'm seeing a lot of shift away from that, but it's still a pretty prevalent narrative where they're like, oh, I have to buy it a Deseret Book, therefore it can't go into a church building or whatever.
Literature's up.
Yeah, you can say it's not true.
Yeah.
And we can all, in whatever sort of status we have
Mhm.
in our faith, perspectives, but it is the prevailing view. It's the prevailing
absolutely.
perspective.
Yeah.
And until we can change that,
Mm-hmm.
which is I think what Nathan tried to do here,
Mhm.
this is a particularly Semitic
Mm-hmm.
Christ. And until enough artists do that and do it in pleasing ways that enough people buy and hang in their house, it will exist.
Yeah. And it just takes people continuing to ask and try, and what you're able to accomplish will
Yeah.
heavily depend on how much your local leadership has slowed down and thought about that or is willing to rethink it. I had a lovely interaction with someone who came into the gallery a few weeks ago. It was a husband and wife, and he's in a stake presidency down in Spanish Fork, and they were working on renovating and redecorating their building, and they and the rest of the stake presidency had sat down and said, we want better images. We don't love everything that the church offers in their, these are the 30 images you can put in the foyer list. And so they specifically went out, found a couple things, including one of my pieces, and then went to their area authority and said, can we do this? And thankfully they said yes.
Good for them.
Yeah,
Nice.
but a lot of time it's just about asking the question, but people are
Yeah.
so hesitant to even ask the question. They're just like, well, this is the approved list, or this is what I think the approved list is. We're just gonna go with this.
Well, they don't think to ask the question.
Yeah, exactly. Mhm. Okay, alrighty. Okay, moving into marrying this with conversations around AI. So last year Elder Gong did a kind of church PR meeting talking about how the church is approaching AI. They're clearly still very much wrestling with what this means like, but these are the guidelines that they're trying to figure out how to implement in their practices, and that they've invited members to think about in their applications as well. So these are the two sections that I think are most applicable. There's, I think, 5 or 6 of them, but that are most applicable to AI in the art space. So people interacting with the church will understand that they are increasing with artificial intelligence. The church will provide attribution for content, so that it's clear what the authorship is. It follows laws and is accountable to them, and will be measured and deliberate so that it outputs that help ensure accuracy, truthfulness, and compliance. And
Nice.
these words here, I think, are ones that we really need to consider when it comes to the use of AI with images, because what does accuracy and truthfulness mean in context of art? That was a very weighted question. I can't answer that, but I think we need to wrestle with it.
So before you go, Kristen, you had.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, what did?
Well, I saw it said they will attribute it when,
Mhm.
only when authenticity or something could be. I mean, that's just like both.
I love it, Kristen.
Well, yeah, and that's a very tricky thing, and I've seen very up close and personal some instances where this has gone a little sideways, because how do they police when a contractor is using AI? And at what point do they draw the line? Because like there's very many levels of using AI.
That's not a bright line at all.
No, not at all.
It's just whatever someone.
Yeah.
Reveal.
Yeah. And some people are more transparent about it than others. So yeah, no, it's very muddy waters at the moment, and I don't envy people having to make decisions.
You're probably, I think it was within the week it was announced that the handbook now has an AI component.
Mhm.
Yes,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I haven't,
As a chat box
Tried it.
attached to it.
yeah, I haven't tried it yet, but be
Yeah.
interested to see how
And
that
I'm
works.
pretty sure that like some of the algorithm on that was based off of the LDS chatbot that Josh from what's his last name?
Coates.
Josh Coates. Yeah, the Josh Coates made. I think the church is using some programming that he did for that.
Interesting.
Esther, another question from Dan Eastman. Christ depictions in the temple seem new. Do you think these are AI generated or influenced?
AI generated, no, I can tell you that for certain. Influence, like I said, that's very hard to say because that'll depend on how much the artist who made them is using AI. So like I know of some very mainstream LDS artists who are doing things where they'll take a picture of a model for Jesus, but then they'll like use AI to generate all of the background figures or like the background of the image. And I've done a little bit of that in some of my work as well. But yeah, they're not just generating something and printing a G-clay and putting it in the temples. I can tell you that for sure.
That's good.
Okay, so thoughts to chew on as we get to the questions. So what questions do the proliferation of AI images of deity force us to ask ourselves and our community? Can and should we determine the prioritized purpose and function of images of deity in Latter-day Saint religious education and liturgy? So this gets into the idea of like, what is the purpose of an image in a religious space, in a religious practice? Is it to explicate a story? Is it to create a meditative space? And the answer could be all of the above. It doesn't need to be one, but what we prioritize will determine how we filter and make decisions. And we currently we aren't having conversations about what we're prioritizing, and we don't have an accepted conclusion to that. If the priority is didacticism, so this idea that like an image is teaching us something, it's explicating a story, it's telling us a narrative, how do we determine the truthfulness of the source material? So this goes back to the idea, if we're generating images of Christ, and if the church's idea is that AI content needs to be truthful, what does it mean for an image of Christ to be truthful if it's based on hundreds of years of complicated and politically entangled images? I don't have the answer.
And it's not just the images, it's the story behind the images before there were ever images.
Yeah.
You know, Elaine Pagels was just interviewed on Radio West. And I mean, we just don't know how much of what we have in the Gospels happened the way it did.
Oh yeah.
So, I mean, before we even have images, we have the story itself. Right? So
yeah, narrative versus history.
yeah.
And
so
what is even
that's-
history?
Yeah, it's complicated.
No, exactly.
We have a couple of parallel events too. We had, I don't even remember what it was. Was it the eighties when we had that ensign picture of Christ and one of the apostles said, "This is as close as it gets."
Dale Parsons in the
Yeah.
red robe.
And the light eyes. But then Akiane, is that how you say her name? The artist that did a picture of Christ. I've got it on my phone, and there was a movie that came out by a Christian organization of a young boy that had a near-death experience. And it's supposed to be based on a true story. And he saw her picture and said, "That's him." Because they've been showing him lots of other pictures. He's like, "No, that's not him." And then, young boy answering the question. So it's interesting to me, and the two pictures are not very close.
Yeah.
So I find that interesting that those are both events that happened in the last 30 years.
Yeah.
And the conclusions are very different about what's true.
There's some fascinating research that Harvey and Bloom highlight in their book, The Color of Christ, that shows how visions of deity track with prevailing trends surrounding depicting that deity. It's a little bit of like a chicken and egg thing, but it's the egg is more consistently how is deity being depicted versus how is deity being visualized in visions. And they looked specifically at like people who'd seen Jesus through like the last 100 or so years, and it consistently tracked with the way that the most popular images of Christ were being painted. I've had some really funny interactions in my personal life with someone who paints Jesus consistently. I had an experience where I used the same model consistently for a lot of my images of Christ at this point. And I showed two very similar paintings to two different women, very, very devout, both women of color. And one of them, Black woman, told me, she's like, I thought Jesus was Black, and then I had a vision of Jesus and he looks like your painting. And my painting's very Semitic. And the other woman, who's Polynesian, was like, I've seen Jesus and he's white. And he doesn't look like your painting. Within like a week of each other. And it was just, such a prime example of like, this is why we just paint Jesus all the different ways, because clearly this is not scientific data. And there is scientific data showing that it's, what our brain concocts when we're visualizing things. Not to say that those aren't profound, genuine spiritual experiences, but the way we process that as visual information is consciously or subconsciously informed by so much of what we've previously seen to that.
Well, and that is the way our brain works anyway.
Yeah.
Is that it filters the outside
We
world
are AI.
based on our hypothesis of what that world looks like.
Exactly.
So absolutely.
Yeah. Mhm.
That's a good statement. We are AI. We're doing the same
We
thing
are
AI
a
is doing.
large language learning model.
Yeah, yeah.
So if the priority is to create a third space between artist and viewer in which a shared belief of deity is testified of, to what degree should technology be moderating that experience? So obviously we're okay with a degree of moderation. We're being moderated by technology right now. We're looking at this on multiple digital screens. It's being broadcasted online. I think most people are comfortable at this point with that degree of moderation in sharing religious ideas and, attending church over Zoom, at least, to some extent or whatever it might be. But at what point does the insertion of an algorithm making decisions in that moderation become a problem? If ever, does it become a problem? Are we asking ourselves these questions? Steve over here is very pro-tech. He's like, never.
Oh, no, I just said, to your point, we are AI. So what's the difference between a wet AI and a computer AI?
I don't know.
Since for thousands of years, wet AIs have been making decisions about the depiction of Christ as you've laid out, they've messed up.
Yeah.
So.
Well, this isn't about
Yeah,
messing
yeah.
up. This is more about moderating. So if the
Oh, I
idea
know,
is
I
that
know.
like, because one of the things I saw that was really fascinating. So this particular image was on the cover of the Ensign last fall, and I posted a reel pointing out the fact that it was either majority or very heavily produced by AI. And the reel went kind of viral and a lot of people freaked out about it. But one of the prevailing comments in it was people feeling very betrayed because when they look at images in the Ensign, or I guess the Leahona now, they're expecting that they're viewing the visual testimony of another member of the church. And so it felt like an act of betrayal to them to find out that it was an AI generated image, not a visual witness of someone else's testimony. This is what I'm trying to get at here is like, at what point does tech moderating make that shared space of like, I believe this, you believe this, we will grow together in this, feel fake, feel insincere, feel insignificant, whatever it may be.
And the church is inconsistent in the way they allow you to view the art in their materials.
Yeah.
For instance, if I read the Leahona on here,
Mhm.
I never can see the cover full
Yeah.
size. And that drives me nuts. It's like, why do you go to the effort to have a beautiful piece of
Yeah.
art and all I can see is a thumbnail?
Yeah.
And some of the articles you can actually blow up the
Mhm.
artwork, which I love to do, or the
Mhm.
photography, others you cannot. And it
And
just seems a little strange to me that
The
they
interior one
don't allow you to
might have
enjoy
to do with
that.
licensing. Because sometimes there'll be like terms
That's
in a
probably true.
contract of like how high
Mhm.
resolution of a file they'll allow to have in a certain context, but I could be wrong.
But the cover drives me nuts.
Yeah, the cover doesn't make sense, yeah. And they're very conscientious with what they put on the cover, like the first presidency has to approve what goes on the cover. So next question is, if large language learning models are iterative and not genuinely generative, can they participate in an ongoing restoration? If the idea is that we are trying to receive and disseminate new truth from the divine, and LLMs are just recycling things that are already in the system, not generating new things, is it actually possible for them to participate in an ongoing restoration?
Or just stuck.
Yeah.
Well,
I think give it 5 years and it will. That's the transition.
Because,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we're talking about AIG, right? Or generative,
Mhm.
I think there's a naivete that humans where we think that no one will ever catch up to us, but I think technology inevitably will. And but at that point, I think that there's, I think, yeah, I don't know, how do I put it? At that point, I think there's gonna be a lot of power in having a personal Christ
Yeah.
to people. So a lot of these questions will still be relevant,
Mhm.
but you will actually be able to create images that capture your own vision in a very personal way.
Yeah. And I think
is
that's
entirely generative.
Yeah, and that's what some of the positive comments on that same post that went viral, were people saying, you know, I've got a very specific family circumstance, I've got a child with some specific disabilities, and this allowed me to generate images of, you know, that child with Christ or Christ in this specific context that no artist is probably gonna paint anytime soon. And I think that's a lovely, wonderful use of it. The ones that just bug me more is when it's just becomes so commercialized and it's influencing the culture broadly. I think the macroeconomics of AI implementation in Christian art are a very different conversation than like the individual micro application of it.
Yeah, he was.
Oh yeah.
Well, I was along the lines of what you just said. I mean, you were asking to what extent can it participate, and I don't know if it'll be in 5 years, but I mean, I think you've kind of already shown that we were widening and it re-narrowed us.
Yeah.
And I think so far that seems to be.
Yeah, well, there's interesting data on like language and the way that AI is affecting language, and there's some theories that it's going to continue to constrict specifically like the English language, and so that there's less and less words used over time.
I believe that, because when
Yeah.
Grammarly is, you know, working with my writing,
Yeah, but
sometimes it's not doing things I would think it's
Yeah.
good, you know,
Yeah.
it's not great. Yeah. And
Yeah.
social media's been narrowing us, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, the issue too is because we've gotten to a point where it's now being fed off of its own generated content. And so there's some interesting charts that show like the usage of certain words and how like they were used, you know, pretty consistently until the hit of AI, and then like a massive spike in like the use of like some specific words. And so it's gonna change how people talk and how people communicate because it's self-iterating the same vocabulary.
Gonna say one more thing really quick about the AI generated image. It's like I fall in a group where I'm not offended at all that it's generated by AI, but I am frustrated that the guy lied about it.
Mhm.
Because he did like deceive a little bit, a lot bit. So that's where it's like, it's not the act, but it's the deception,
Yeah.
right? And that's something I think.
How is the sausage made?
Yeah,
We all eat hot dogs at the end of the day, but
we know what's in
do
it.
we know it's not?
I'm a vegetarian, I mean,
You're better than the rest of us.
I'm not better.
Allegedly.
Carnivore, I don't eat hot dogs.
Oh,
Ed, you had a,
You know, I use AI all the time.
Yeah.
And I love it. And, but I haven't used it a lot in images, although I have. I designed prosthetic hands and I asked it to give me some, you know, nice looks for a child's hand, okay? And I really liked what it gave me, you know, but what my question is, I don't know enough about AI, even though I'm an engineer and scientist, to know whether this is true, but it seems to me like you can steer AI forward into creative realms. It's not just mishmashing, you know, what was before, okay? And I'm pretty sure it can do that based on some things that I've done with it. So.
Oh, yeah, it's capable of it for sure.
Yeah, but you made the point that we're just rehashing everything that's before, but I think AI actually will leap forward too, if you steer it that way and say, you know, give me a Christ that, you know, like you said, can inform my child with disabilities, you know, and have them relate to that person. You might end up with an image that's never been done before.
Yeah.
Okay, but it allows for my child that has a disability to relate to that person more.
Yeah, and the issue is not so much that can't be applied on the individual level, and I definitely see that. The issue is that because it's so easy for people to go in and just generate the default, that the default is being propagated at insanely exponential rates. And so what people are being exposed to on the daily is continuing to be narrowed.
Vanilla.
Yeah. And so it's watering down what people see just, you know, in their scroll through Instagram, what like I've seen so many like church programs and baptism announcements that have those same generic and great, I call them grayish Jesus. Somebody recently told me they called him chicken nugget Jesus.
Would DEI be sort of influencing all this? Like, we don't wanna like have a diverse.
anti-DI.
I don't think it's
I mean, the
consciously.
anti-DEI.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's just Utah.
I think it's,
No, are you kidding?
Well, it's more, but Utah, I mean, like Utah law specifically swung really hard.
yeah.
Yes, it
Yeah.
would.
I don't think that's
Federal too.
broadly influencing what's
Military's
being created.
eliminating all those targets.
Yeah. But I think it definitely subconsciously taints people against any conversation that would push back against the mainstream models. Like, I was in a meeting a few years ago and was arguing for a more diverse depiction of Christ, among other things, in religious context. And a very well-meaning individual said to me, we don't want to do this too, he's like, I agree with you, we should do this. He's like, but we don't want to do this too quickly because it might be viewed as political. And so that's what I run into, is that there's hesitance to shift towards a more diverse model because it's become conflated with politics. And there's oftentimes not even a pause to consider, well, if it's the right thing, shouldn't we just be doing it anyways? Like, we do that a lot in other spheres.
What's true?
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, oh no, it's political, so we're just not gonna touch it. Instead of being like, okay, but is it worth doing it anyways? Are we having that conversation? Okay, I think I've got a few points here left. So while AI has radically democratized access to image creation, the materials it produces are as much an accurate indication of individual and collective understandings of Christ as a scroll through social media is an accurate representation of the average experiences of Americans. Especially here in Utah with the hashtag everybody's an influencer. Which is funny because like I'm on a very small scale an influencer, which I have mixed feelings about on a daily basis. So something else I think about a lot as an artist who spent a lot of time developing my skills and wrestles a lot with how that melds with my spirituality and then expresses itself and what that means for my professional life, is that AI generated images practically eliminate the time and training and input required to make a religious image, which is not wholesale a bad thing, but one of the things that I see happening a lot is it's also eliminated the automatic requirement of asking soul-searching questions during the creation of that image. That I think part of the reason we're seeing so many fluffy marshmallow puff type, not like literally, but just like that's what it feels like to me seeing those images. It's like they just feel very saccharine, very just sweet and like surface level and impersonal. And I think part of the reason of that is that you don't have to stop and ask why you're painting Jesus. I have to spend 60 hours asking myself why I'm painting Jesus every single time I paint Jesus. And it's a very soul-searching experience. And sometimes it's a little bit of a traumatic experience, depending on what I'm doing. And I really have to wrestle with what it is that I'm making and putting out in the world. And by removing that barrier, it removes the accountability. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't artists who, are painting traditional paintings and doing things that are crazy or nonsensical or naughty, like, that's still, but it makes it a whole lot easier to do that now. And that concerns me as a Christian who cares about the types of images of deity that are being put out into the world.
That one's yours, by the way.
Yeah, that one is mine. And the Church History Museum is that one.
Yeah, I really like that one.
Okay, so my final kind of questioning thought here is, in this sense, the aesthetic has become an anesthetic through individuals' pursuit of the easily accessible common denominator. This idea that we aren't feeling as deeply because we are prioritizing ease, accessibility, commodification of images within our community. So to end on a hopeful note, because I think there are lots of good things in the future, both on the tech front and on the art creation front. And I get to see a lot of that in my space running the gallery and just seeing the images that come in every week. We just hung our Easter show and got 30 new images of Christ or, Christ related topics that are very diverse aesthetically and culturally. And there's just so much energy in especially the Utah art space right now to create really new and wonderful things. But what I hope to see and what I try to do with the content that I create and the things that I do is that we as a community will more fully engage with an ongoing restoration through our visual culture. That images are one of the best ways to disseminate memorable content. That after smell, images are what the human brain remembers best. And so we need to be responsible and critical and thoughtful with how we are creating and disseminating images of the things that matter most to us. And that we'll seek to use technology to amplify the voices and create opportunities for the historically marginalized. Because that's something else that I'm seeing. I work with a lot of women artists, a lot of artists of color, and a lot of them are feeling very discouraged at this point because there's no way they can compete with, a white influencer who has money to order thousands of prints of an AI image and sell those. And so they're having to really rethink, what is my business model, so I can even get my voice out there and get it heard and get it through the noise of all these mass-produced vanilla images. And I hope that we can really take accountability as a community to find out what that means and to evolve and adapt and to use technology through that process. I think there's ways that we can integrate AI into those processes to make sure that the voices that need to be heard are heard, and that we are engaging thoughtfully with our theology, with our culture, and with our perceptions of the divine. I'm focused.
Where's your, gallery?
It's in Provo on Center Street.
Oh, it's that.
So it was written vision, and you and Faith Matters took it over wildly quickly
Yes.
because it kind of crashed. with
Firestorm,
Written
yeah.
Vision, yeah. It's a beautiful space. Faith Matters also has monthly gatherings there too.
Yeah.
Speakers.
Multiple monthly gatherings.
Monthly. So if you go, I guess is that on your site or Faith Matters that you can see what they're showing?
I think
I think
Faith
it's
Matters
on
has their ones that are specific to them. Because
Yeah.
we've got sort of like a gradation of events. We've got
Yeah,
ones
yeah.
that like I run that are art related. We have like community members that come in and use the space, and then we have Faith Matters sponsored events.
Right.
So if you wanted to see all and everything that's happening, go to the compassgallery.com/events, and that's how it's all and everything.
Yeah. It's a beautiful space. It really is.
Yeah.
It's turned out.
We also rent it out. That's how Faith Matters funds their half of it. So if you're planning on hosting a wedding or a birthday party, call us.
One more, question or comment from Mike Maxwell. Interested in your thoughts from a former employee of an AI/ML platform developer. I don't see any likelihood of a future where AI can replicate anything close to the experience of human consciousness. AI can't feel love, smell, hear, feel emotion, contemplate, or ask original questions drawn from that uniquely human experience. So regardless of how an image is generated, AI has to draw it from a very limited experience set, which is just a complex set of algorithms. That is a form of art, but superficial in that it is drawn from a very narrow information set that has very little similarity to human thought and consciousness. Art also needs to evolve to more fully represent human experience, rather than just simple and easily replicable forms of it. Your thoughts?
Well, that's a lot to unpack. Yeah, this is kind of part of some ongoing conversations I've had with artists, because there are people that have deeply emotional experiences with AI generated images. And so much of your experience with art is, in the eye of the beholder. It's what you're bringing to that conversation. Now, from a purely religious perspective, I don't believe that AI can receive revelation. But I deeply believe that artists that are seeking to create with the spirit frequently do, and in many ways function as prophets, lowercase p, in a community. And I see that play out on a weekly, if not monthly basis at the gallery, where you have people come in and say things to the extent of, I needed this painting today, or I needed this at this point in my faith journey. And then you talk to the artist and you're like, oh, I was clearly prompted to make this. Like, that is a conversation I've seen replayed over and over and over again. So is it possible for somebody to have a deeply meaningful experience with something that can't feel? Yes. Is there work of God to be done through artists that will always be done through artists? Yes, too. I don't know if that answers the question.
The person that said like, oh, I needed this, was it in regards to an AI painting?
We don't show AI stuff in my gallery, so.
Oh, okay. Because then I
I'm
wonder
sure
like,
people do have those,
where's
yeah.
the transparency?
Mhm.
Because I've had like images created on thoughts that I've had, but it's very personal based off of
Mhm.
like my own meditation visualizations that I
Yeah.
have. So that speaks a lot to me, just to see like an actual visual
Mhm.
image rather than just what's in my head.
Yeah.
But I would imagine it's the transparency, because there's things that I see online. My husband can tell like this if it's
Mhm.
AI. I can't. So he'll tell me that, and immediately there's like this level of disappointment
Mhm.
because like you said, it's that trust, right? It feels like we're being betrayed or whatever. So I'm curious if someone were to say, oh, this image speaks to me, and then you say, yeah, it's created by AI, if that would change.
I think it depends on the person. I think there's people that it doesn't bother at all. I think people are like it deeply disturbs and everything in between. And that's why I think it needs to be transparent so that people have that choice. Like I've been describing people as organic vegetables. Like, do people choose not to buy organic vegetables when they have the choice? Yes. But people want that choice and they want to know what that process is. And I think it's behooves us as a community to offer them the ability to make that choice.
So one of the things that comes up for me is like, and I think you kind of set it up this way, is that we as a Latter-day Saint institution and a broader American Christianity institution, we're not good at interrogating this kind of question.
No.
Right? So even before AI, we weren't good at interrogating, you know, I mean, we still haven't dealt with race in our own church, right? I mean, like, we can't,
We
it's
scrape the surface.
barely.
Yeah.
And every time we scrape the surface, we're like, okay, we're done, right?
Yeah.
Like, that was enough,
Like,
right?
oh, oh.
Do you think that AI though creates an opportunity to have that conversation in a bit of a more profound way? Do you sense it creating any new openness to that? Or do you think that they're just responding the way that most ours and the rest of the American institutions are responding the same way they always have?
I think a little of both. And I don't know, if it's net one way or the other at this point. What I'm seeing, at least in my experience, is that because, like, I'll address specifically like race, because AI proliferates a certain racialized image of Christ. It also prioritizes just broadly racialized views of beauty. Like, what does it mean to make a beautiful human? Like, there's definitely racial biases in the way that it creates that. It's forced people to address those questions because it's everywhere. And so people who previously, weren't thinking about the fact that like, oh, all the pictures of Jesus are white, are like, oh wait, like literally all of the pictures of Jesus are white, so you can't escape them anymore. But there's also plenty of people that are just going along the merry way, and same old, and it hasn't clicked for them. So I don't know if it's one way or the other. Cumulatively, yeah.
I look at it this way that, prehistoric individuals used a stick and a rock to make a painting, a little bit later, they found paint. A little bit later, lately they've been using photographs, okay? And now we have AI. I think as an engineer, I use AI all the time, all day, okay? Why I just look at it as an artist can use AI as a tool to make beautiful things, even maybe more beautiful than they've ever done before. And they could do it with all the passion and all the, communicating all their ideas and all their feelings, just as well as they could, the cave person could do it. It's a chalk.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a really long question. There was a lot to unpack in that question. And like, so the first part of the question, I want to address this just really quick, because it's like AI can't see, it can't hear, it can't feel it. Sociopaths can't feel, blind people can't see, and deaf people can't hear, but they're still human. Right. And so I say that like I don't know if it's important they can or can't. It's a tool. And Christ, without being a doctor, snapped a finger and healed people, but it doesn't detract from the act of spending, hours of time in a hospital, right? And all of the efforts of a physical experience to like cause somebody to be healed. I think from my perspective, it's a tool. How is it used? And who is using it and why?
Yeah.
And if it's used in deception, it's going to manifest as deception. If it's used for goodness, it will be a tool for goodness, right? And it's so to the point, like your question, which is do you see AI leading towards some of these issues being addressed? I would tweak that a little bit and say, has AI facilitated people who are incapable of generating the content or generating the images or generating the material or generating the technology to address these issues? Is it facilitating people to go and do it? But if there's things that are important to you that maybe you didn't have the time to do, you can actually now wear multiple hats and do those things in less time and be a voice for those things that you care about. Yeah.
And I think the same issues that we face with algorithms that make decisions about people, whether it's court systems or any of the others. The same thing exists for the needs of the members of the church that are not from Northern Europe. And you know, the majority, there are more Spanish speaking members than English speaking. I have two daughters-in-law of color, both Latinas, and they don't like their skin. And the church with the Book of Mormon and a lot of other things makes them feel uncomfortable in their skin. And I don't think AI takes us there. I think it's gonna, by its nature, perpetuate the biases that already exist in the culture and accentuate those without taking the conscious step to step outside and say, the purpose of art can also be used for
Mhm.
including people
Mhm.
and helping them feel good about themselves
Yeah.
by having images that reflect something they recognize in the mirror.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the body of art will lead AI down that pathway. I think we have to manually push us
Oh, absolutely,
down that
yeah.
pathway. And
Mhm. It's not the path of least
you know,
resistance, for sure.
I've often talked to one of my daughters-in-law about, you know, nobody likes her skin color. I wish I had some color, you know, and she wishes she was white. And the difference is, at the end of the day, mine is a fashion thought. Hers is a lived experience.
Mhm.
And even in the chapel, she catches all kinds of terrible comments from Latter-day Saints.
Mhm.
And neither one of them live in Salt Lake anymore because they've had so many bad experiences. And it's something where I think art can help our globally growing church find a way to represent that, gee, Christ maybe does understand me, even though I look different than
Mhm.
everybody else in this chapel.
Yeah.
And I don't think AI takes us there. I think that
Yeah.
has to be a very conscious thing. And our church isn't good at it yet at all.
I'll pick
There's
up on
lots
that.
of,
I'll pick up on that point. As I talked to Nathan about this painting, that is exactly where it came from. He has a mother who believes that she should have a place beside the men in the church or who run the church.
Okay, sure.
That's why Nathan had the woman talking, not Jesus talking. The face is Semitic. It's not
It is.
the blue-eyed Aryan Northern European. And I think that's exactly what we're saying, is that the source of whatever we do with AI is totally dependent on those perspectives and the sort of individuality of the creator or the user of the instrument.
And if the tool actually advances to the point where it will consciously go down
Oh
pathways
my.
that we are not going down, then maybe
be
we can,
valuable.
maybe it can be very valuable. But at this
How?
point, it seems like,
2001.
yeah, but at this point, if they're gleaning from past experience, past experience is very biased. And I've benefited from the bias, but it is very difficult for others.
yeah. Respond to a couple things in your comment there. When it comes to like talking about the Latter-day Saint institution and art, something I always try to encourage people to think about is it's really easy for the narrative to be like, oh, our institution is racist, our institution is biased, is bigoted, whatever it is. And reframe that as people are biased and bigoted. And our institution is a product of humanity, but it's a community that calls us to transcend that. And so we have the tools in our space to do that. We have the community that calls us to do that. And so making sure we're not just throwing the baby out with the bathwater and saying, this is the community we're called to do better, because you're going to find this anywhere.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
and also to like to your daughter-in-law's experiences, the biggest wake up moment for me as a youth was I lived in the Philippines for a couple of years when I was 13 and 14. My dad's from the Philippines. And I was at a young women's activity, and one woman came up to me and said, you should be so grateful that you're half white because you've got lighter skin than me. And I know, like, that was a lot to unpack as a 13-year-old, you know, who's like gangly and had braces and definitely did not feel pretty. But it was just kind of a slap in the face of like, because I had grown up in a very diverse community with, you know, some really interesting racial politics. I'm from Hawaii, and there's a lot of like very unusual dynamics there. And so I'd had some interesting and hard experiences, but nothing like the mainstream kind of conversations around colorism and racism in that sense. And I was like, oh, wow, like this is so deeply ingrained for somebody that, you know, another 13-year-old girl would come up to me and be like, you're lucky because you're white. and you're lucky because you're prettier than me. And she meant it sincerely, and she meant it as a compliment. And I was like, oh, we've got a lot to do here. Like, it was just like a call of like, I have work I need to do with my life. And I see so much of that, and we should be a community that transcends that. And I think we can be. And there's great move toward that. The church just unveiled a new sculpture for Temple Square yesterday. It's the 10 virgins, and it's all different races, nationalities for each of the, or it's the 5 wise virgins and 5 of the 10
The
virgins.
Provo Temple mural was always nice.
Yeah. And there's very conscientious efforts towards that. But what I see from like my kind of positioning in the economic structure of Latter-day Saint art is that the best thing that can happen at this point is for individuals to care. Because, and I've had this conversation with so many decision makers within the institution, that it doesn't matter how much they want diverse art, if good diverse art is not being created on its own for them to select from, it's hard for them to find good ones. And if there aren't artists that are being nurtured to create that type of art, they're not going to have high level professionals that can create that type of art. And so individual members have so much power in this conversation to go out there and buy art from artists that are trying to have this conversation or trying to create these things, you know, even if it's little print, like that adds up at the end of the day. And so it's not something we should or can just shirk off to like, well, when the institution gets to it, they're going to get to it. Like, no, like it's going to be grassroots.
Well, and music has dealt with this for the last 3 decades,
Yeah.
so art will have to figure out its
Mhm.
pathway forward.
Yeah.
And in some senses, some of the quality has gone out of music.
Mhm.
In a lot of sense.
There's also a lot more breadth, a lot more interesting ideas because there aren't gatekeepers anymore.
Mhm.
But you have to really see,
Dissemination is democratized.
but the level of quality is harder to find.
Mhm.
And I'm assuming art may face that same
Oh, yeah.
challenge of.
Yeah.
Is it really worth spending 60 hours thinking before I
Mhm.
start? When others don't.
Mhm.
And yet I think that's a critical part of what
Yeah.
you do.
Yeah, and that's comes down to a lot of like, how are we educating creatives to think about themselves like a business while maintaining roots and, you know, their ethical model and what they're contributing. That's a conversation I have on a weekly.
And my middle name is Kelly.
That was nice.
I was born home.
That's awesome. He's the chief.
Well, we probably ought to wrap it up. We've got tired little girl there. Did you have?
Well, after you think it's true.
So, thank you. Esther, that was really fascinating.
Yes.
It would be fun to just keep talking about things all night. You know, I wanted something, I typically every April, I try to pick something around Christ. Sometimes Earth Day, they're related to me, in my mind. So I, for some reason, this just popped in my head to talk about this subject. And I think you did a wonderful job about it. As we go through the month, I would encourage us to just contemplate Christ. You know, I've been in the morning reading a few verses of the Gospels of the very final days of Christ, as he's, you know, basically captured and what he goes through in each of the Gospels. Only a few verses, but it gives me enough to kind of ponder about that. I just want to say that there's no individual in my life that means more. And I believe that Christ, you know, is somehow a God and was resurrected. I don't know that. I do know from experience that his teachings on the ground here on earth have made a huge difference in my life. And I can definitely say that's made all the difference in the world for me. And I have great hope and expectation that all the beautiful things that we believe Christ represents in this life and the next are real. But if they aren't, I am satisfied that he has helped me live a better life now. And I'm very, very grateful for that. and for all the beautiful things and people of all traditions that point us towards those kind of values and ethics. And most every tradition seems to have something. So,
Amen.
thank you, everyone. If it wasn't so late, I would have us sing, I don't know, do we have time to sing a little hymn of Christ? And someone got a suggestion that we know well enough, we can do a cappella? Kristen, do you have anything comes to mind, or do you have a
Well,
favorite?
came to mind, so that was, I felt my Savior's love, but right about that thing.
Yeah, that's a pretty well known one. I like that. We can always look it up on our handy digital tool, gospel. The gospel app, right, if we need, or do we know the first verse well enough? Okay, do you want to lead us in it, Kristen? Ah, lovely, thank you. Is it meant to read before we close?
Oh, go ahead. I'm
Well,
sorry.
no, I'm just asking, because I don't know what it says.
The Great Salt Lake.
Oh, yeah, so that was in my email. So Mike Maxfield, that's commented a few times. He's the Salt Lake chapter head of Latter-day Saint
Earth.
Earth Stewardship. Thank you. Really good guy, and he's been working hard. So they have created a great event. Not just, I don't think it's just the Salt Lake chapter, but the Earth Stewardship people have created a great event. It's in my email. Did he give the time and stuff? Anyway, I have the poster they created in the email that I sent. So hopefully you saw that. And that's coming up in April. That's what I can't remember. Unless it's the 19th. Yeah, why don't you, because I don't see that comment specifically. Thanks.
He says, given the message of the prayer, perhaps you can share our upcoming LDSES Great Salt Lake Service Project and Easter celebration. It will be the morning of April 19th at Great Salt Lake State Park with a diverse cross-section of Utah community members. Details on Just Serve, and then he gives a link, but you might be
The link is
familiar
also on
with
the web, on the email that I
Just
gave you.
Serve.
Yeah. So thank you. And thank you, Mike, for all that good work. Fine. Left the room. Let's see, who would like to give a closing prayer? Anybody that would-
Sure, I'll do it.
Thanks, Martina. And again, as always, I've had people of other faiths pray. You can pray however you feel comfortable with.
Our Father in heaven, thank you for this beautiful evening. Grateful for all those who are attending and the messages that have been shared and thoughts that have inspired us. We're grateful for all the ways that Christ has been a presence in each of our lives, and we're just grateful for the opportunity of living this human life experience. Please help us all travel home safely tonight. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you on Zoom. Thank you all that are here. Thank you to the Iversons again. And they've put out some food over there. It's very kind of them. Always appreciate you being here. Thank you.
And you are the organizer.
Oh, thank you.
All right.
Where was home Hawaii?
Oahu.
It's
Sunny Park.